go ahead and get started. My name is Citlali. I'm the Joy de la Cruz Art and Activism intern here at the Cross Cultural Center, and I want to thank all of you for coming today to our presentations, which is Creating Through Lived Experience, which will be showcasing the work of Jessica Caldas. Before we begin, I'd like to give a short land acknowledgement. As UC San Diego sits on the unceded territory and traditional homelands of the Kumeyaay people, we as members of the UC San Diego community must acknowledge the legacy of the Kumeyaay people. We also acknowledge that even as we work from home, most of us are still occupying Indigenous lands. Please join me in a moment of silence to honor the original people of this land. Alrighty, thank you all. And here below we have a short resource that you can check out to see which Indigenous lands you occupy. So you can just feel free to text your city and state to this number and you'll find out which Indigenous lands you occupy. Before we begin, I'd also like to establish a content warning, as some of the work that we will be featuring today will go over issues that may be triggering for some as they deal with gender-based violence, sexual assault, and mental health. I'd also like to disclose and apologize that the closed captioning will only be capturing my voice and none of the other panelists. I apologize, but this will be recorded and uploaded to YouTube, where the closed captioning will be available for all voices. Now, about our amazing artist today. Jessica Caldas is a Puerto Rican American artist, advocate, and activist who is based in Florida and Georgia. She draws on various personal narratives, different stories that she's collected, literature, and social movement to influence her work. She incorporates different artistic components: drawing, collage, sculpture, installation, performance, and many more. She's very interested in telling stories about people and communities that connect to larger social justice issues by handling experiences that are masked by silence, difficult to approach for many, and stigmatized. As we've said, these experiences range from women's issues to gender-based violence and mental health. However, she doesn't just stop at art. She also has a lot of advocacy work. She lobbied for policy at the local level in Georgia and spent time with the YWCA Georgia Women's Policy Institute in 2016 General Assembly to ensure that the rape kit bill, to pass the rape kit bill and to stop a bill that would have harmed the safety of sexual assault survivors on college campuses. So I'd like you all to welcome Jessica, our artist for today.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so grateful to be here and honored to be able to share with you all tonight. I sound okay? Yes. All right. I guess I'll start first. I just want to talk a little bit about my background. I grew up making art, and I like to sort of acknowledge right off the bat that I've been pretty privileged in that my family has always been really supportive of art making in general. Growing up, art was a part of my life from a young age. My grandfather was always a painter, and his house was covered in paintings. And my mother had jobs in the arts from when I was a young age. And so for me, making art was something that was a part of my life constantly, but also something I knew could be a reality for my future and which was supported constantly by my family. And I like to start with that acknowledgement because I know that's not the case for all youth or all children. And as we get older, we can come up against a lot of barriers and obstacles pretty quickly to that kind of dream or vision. So it was hugely impactful to me that my family was constantly supportive of that. So when I decided to go to college, there was no question that I was going to be an art major, and I got my undergraduate degree at the University of Georgia, and where I'm from in Georgia. Well, I'm from Atlanta, but which is where I grew up, and I knew I would be getting an art degree, and so I did, and my undergraduate degree was in printmaking. And when I left school, I was very, very fortunate to receive a printmaking residency. I applied for it, I worked hard to get it, but I also got it right after I left undergrad. And I think that was also hugely impactful to the fact that I have a practicing art career now, because it helped bridge the sort of art making from your undergraduate degree, which can feel really abstract and special in that place, but then can be really hard to bridge to the real world. And so having that residency right out of undergrad was incredibly useful. And that was with the Atlanta Printmakers Studio. And I've always sort of credited that for my continued art making into my young adulthood. And then the other hugely impactful thing to me early on in my art career was that right after I received that residency, I also got my first sort of real adult job. And I was working part-time for a nonprofit in Atlanta called the Atlanta Volunteer Lawyers Foundation, which would become sort of the way I would find my path to the kind of artwork and the kind of work I do now, and started to do then, and really started to understand. Because when you leave, I think when you're younger and you're making work, it can be really hard to focus in on what you want to do, and what you want to do with your work. And it definitely was for me. It was a huge question. And I knew I was interested in family, and I knew I was interested in relationships and things like that, because that had been such a huge part of my life, but with familiar relationships and social relationships. But I didn't know what that would mean for my art making. But then I got this job, the Atlanta Volunteer Lawyers Foundation. And specifically, I started working with their domestic violence project. And I was coordinating that project. At first, I was just a volunteer, but I was working with them so frequently, and then a position opened up, and I was recommended for that position, which I would think was a little bit of luck and a little bit of work once again. And I have to say that coordinating that project was one of the most, the hugely life-changing things for me. Wally, if you want to go ahead to the next slide. Coordinating a domestic violence project, and specifically the project I was working with in Atlanta, meant that I was working with survivors of domestic violence 5 days a week for at least 40 hours a week, but honestly, probably a lot more than that, since it was a nonprofit and that we tend to overextend ourselves in the nonprofit world. But part of that role was working daily with survivors to help them obtain temporary protective orders, which is what a lot of people understand to be restraining orders. In a lot of actual court language, they're called temporary protective orders or temporary restraining orders. And I had to learn about all of the sort of legalese that goes into obtaining these, and help survivors translate the stories and the experiences they had had into the language that the court would accept onto these legal documents, and that would afford them the protection they needed. And often only afford them a portion of the protection they really needed, and sort of at a very basic level. Because while temporary restraining orders or temporary protective orders can be very useful, in some cases they can be sort of like a Band-Aid, and they don't necessarily provide all of the protection and help that a survivor really truly needs. So our office, which helps file for these on behalf of survivors, also assisted with legal representation. We did our best to assist with other wraparound services, connecting them to shelters or financial assistance or other needs that they needed. And so for me, this was actually my first experience being exposed to this issue in a daily way. I had known women who had been victims, both in my family and outside of my family directly, but I had not been, I was not a survivor of domestic violence, and I was not as aware of some of the really complicated nature and realities of that issue. But when you're exposed to it in a daily way, either by virtue of the direct experience or as an advocate, you start to understand how much is not understood by the greater public and how much is often gotten wrong by media or people who mean well but maybe just don't know or don't understand, how many questions get asked all the time that are not fair or not right, how much misinformation is spread, and how much just general cultural misunderstanding there is around this issue. And for me, it was incredibly frustrating because I was going into this office every day and feeling like I was doing something, but that it was never enough, and feeling like I would leave and not be able to clearly communicate what was happening. And it was something that was happening on this monumental scale, in our backyard, in this city that I loved and lived in, to everybody. You know, it was beyond any kind of barrier. It was just very intense and very difficult for me to process. And I remember about 6 months in, having a really bad day with some really, really hard cases and some clients that I deeply cared about, and realizing I had to figure out what to do that was more than just this day job. And so I started making and thinking about my artwork in terms of like telling these stories and sharing them. And so what you're looking at here is one of the earlier pieces I did around this idea. And you have to remember I had at this point a printmaking background primarily, and a drawing background as well. And so I was thinking a lot in terms of layers and text, and this idea that, sorry, that might be my earrings. Is that better? So I was thinking a lot in terms of layers and text and ideas that were more complex than sort of a surface viewing could allow you to understand. And that really, to really deeply understand such an experience, you have to look a lot deeper and understand that there are these levels and intricacies within each level that make it really challenging. And so if you can skip to the next slide. So one of the first bodies of work I built around this to talk about these ideas was primarily printmaking, and was using different printmaking techniques layered together and collaged together to talk about those levels, and to talk about sort of the personal experiences that I was witnessing, as well as sort of how that translated into a legal way and how it translated into a larger social way too. So I was trying to use these images and this text and this legal language and this personal language all on top of each other to try to illustrate how complex these ideas were and how many things that we don't think about that are happening in a daily way to constantly around this issue. You can skip to the next slide too. These are just a couple of the images from that first body of work. And so I made these, and they brought up a lot of questions for me about ownership of stories and my position within the work. And it was very complicated for me because I felt like I thought the work was strong in terms of talking about the ideas I was interested in sharing sort of in a generalized sense this information, but there were two problems for me that were sort of constantly at the back of my mind, which was one, that although I was deeply entrenched in this work and in that way in the community, it wasn't really talking about sort of a direct experience in terms of whether or not I had experienced domestic violence. And then the second one being that I was feeling like I wanted to help people get to a place of action, not just like an understanding or like an acknowledgement of the issue, which is, I think, one of the hardest things when you're working as like maybe an activist in arts, is like most people, you know, they have an abstract understanding that domestic violence is wrong and they agree with that. But when you start to talk about the really complicated stuff like financial abuse or emotional abuse or things like that, there's a disconnect for them on some of those more subtle issues, or when they're talking about consent or things like that. And so I wanted there to be a little bit more like activation than I felt like these prints were able to provide. And so we'll go to the next slide. I started thinking more in terms of like bodily experiences, while still contending with this constant like push and pull between the fact that while I was an advocate for domestic violence survivors, I myself was not one. And what I started creating was a performance piece that I thought could allow for conversation and sort of room for questions and engagement in a different way than the prints allowed. And so I created, I would say this is the first performance piece I created. I think technically there's a piece I did early before this that used performance to a degree, but I would say this is the first like fully fleshed out performance piece I began to create, and I called it 3 Every Day. And the idea was that I'd come across the statistic that 3 women every day in the United States are killed due to domestic violence, which is an outrageous number. And actually, when I started the project, it was in 2015. At this point, the number is, I think, higher. It's closer to 4 every day, based on the last time I read about this particular statistic. The performance itself was only 10 minutes long, but it was filled with movement and language that we would recite that was also reflective of other statistics, such as the fact that it takes a person on average 7 times to leave an abusive relationship before they stay away. That a person who's in an abusive relationship, their chances of being killed increase 70% when they're actively trying to leave, and things like that. Things that people don't necessarily know actually make it harder to leave. It's one of the most, I think, difficult questions that is often sort of parroted when people encounter domestic violence, is this idea of like, why didn't you leave? Which is I think maybe a natural question to think if you're not aware, but is unfortunately like rife with all of this like challenge. And so we would, the first year I created this piece, I gathered about 50 women and other folks to help support the piece, either performing it with me or documenting it or standing guard as we like performed it, because the idea was that we would perform all over the city of Atlanta and in public spaces, and there would be 3 of us performing every day for the month of October, which is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And not only would we perform the piece, we'd show up in a public space and perform it, we also stick around and have a conversation with anybody who was left and watching. And so we'd answer questions, we'd engage with them about their reaction to the piece and what they thought, and we'd talk to them about sort of our own experiences or the experiences of others, and just really engage them in a conversation around domestic violence, which for many people was either something they'd never really talked to just a stranger about or much of anybody. So it was actually very interesting. And, you know, I had to get all these women to perform with me, and I never really intended it, but one of the amazing byproducts of this first year of the project was that like it almost became like a community practice, because there were so many of us doing this piece every day and like having these conversations and just like talking about this really hard thing in this really organic, natural way with people that, and engaging them in something really hard, really immediately. You can you can go to the next slide. There's a couple of slides of the performance. And we did this, I mean, it's a very loud, very active performance. That even though it's only 10 minutes, it's definitely attention grabbing. And we perform it for 3 years, we did it. And each year the group performing it got a little bit smaller. You can go to the next slide. So the third year, it was just 5 of us. And actually the 5 of us became an art collective called Living Melody Collective. And they actually helped me shape the final performance year pretty specifically to also engage with ideas of recovery, because the first couple of years really felt more focused on sort of, again, this like the reality rather than like how we might picture the future looking, which became a major concern of mine over the course of the performance. You can go on to the next slide. So these are just all stills from that performance in various places in Atlanta. You can go on to the next. So, you know, once I started opening myself up to performance and mediums outside of printmaking and drawing, I really started to understand that I could create through the use of my body and the use of movement, really different ways of engaging audiences with ideas that I was interested in exploring and issues that are really challenging to talk about in sort of a normal conversation. But can be really eye-opening if you can figure out a way to engage people in an artistic way that then opens them up to maybe an experience that they haven't had or they don't understand completely. And so that became a really central part of what I wanted to do through the pieces I was developing. And so this next series of performances that these images show are a performance called Should Want Need, which I developed and sort of performed in various locations in various ways also over a couple of years. You can go to the next slide. And generally the idea was connected to mental health. I was dealing a lot with language as well. I started to think about the sort of toll my own mental health was having, but also the more people I talked to about their experiences, the more I understood that these ideas that we have about ourselves are often very harsh and heavy and combative when we're like so generous and kind with others, and thinking about the weight of that language and the labor of it and how it affects us physically, even if it's something that's just mental. And so Should Want Need revolved around developing like an experience that I could perform of like what the mental like work of that language is, and like how that's a little bit violent to ourselves. But then also, if you'll go to the next slide, would often, well, I'm sorry, I think there's slides where there's more people interacting, but people could enter these spaces with me or assist me in the performances in different ways or engage with the performances in different ways. You can go to the next slide. And so again, like mostly I was just interested in the way performance, and this also started to lead into more installation work as well, could really bring people into these experiences and these ideas that I was exploring that I knew were fairly universal and often not talked about in a really public way. They're just hard things, right? Or things that we maybe, or that maybe kind of have this stigma or this weight attached to them that make them less palatable for a conversation just in our day-to-day. So if you'll go to the next slide. This was a really great performance, because I remember several people would walk up to me and try to like help me with the cinder blocks, but then a couple of people would be like, I don't think you're supposed to. And so one of the really interesting things of these performances is you hear people like having conversations about what to do. And it's just a really interesting byproduct. You can keep going to the next slide. And the next. So as I'm sort of like developing performances and pieces that deal with these larger issues that I know everybody's kind of dealing with, I'm also starting to think about my own personal experiences and how I can share more personal things through my work. And so, and around the same time, I was also starting to get really involved with policy work. Lolly mentioned that I did work with some local legislation in Georgia, and it was primarily around sexual assault related bills, because a woman I knew who was also engaged in that work, and who's the reason I got into lobbying at a local level as a citizen, knew that I had a history with sexual assaults and also with domestic violence survivors, which is of course two issues that are deeply tied together. And so when she was working on this bill, she brought me into the fold. And it was for that work, I wrote for the first time about my experience with sexual assault in a very public way. I published an op-ed sort of asking the public to support this bill that would really help with this rape kit backlog, which is a huge issue in our country if you're not aware. And it was the first time I'd ever really talked publicly about my own sexual assault. And I remember it being sort of like terrifying, despite all of the other things I had done with like my body performance or the other issues I'd talked about. But it also felt like something that I should be very willing to do, because this had become a part of who I was as an artist, right? It's talking about things that we don't talk about and sharing them and then making them accessible, right? So it was that same year was actually the 10-year anniversary of my assault. And so I decided to own it in a way through a performance piece, which was a part of a larger curated experience that I had worked on with many artists in Atlanta, where we were talking about love and sex and intimacy and consent and all of these ideas and how they're related to each other through performances and panels and conversations. And sort of as a part of those events, I decided I would do this performance piece on the anniversary of my assault, on the literal 10-year anniversary. And so it was another relatively short performance. You can cycle through these if you'd like, Sally. That I think it was not more than 15 minutes long. It wasn't super long. And it just involved language again, movement, and just some ideas that I'd been exploring since I'd written this op-ed about my piece. And it was really cathartic for me. I just hadn't really made something so personal yet. While I felt like I was personally tied as an advocate to the work previously, as a domestic violence advocate, or as a person who struggles with mental health, I felt like this was most directly related to a really specific experience. And for that reason, there was a success there for me that translated even more than other work had. I don't know that I can define it really well, but it just made the most sense. And it was a piece that I could talk about in really direct ways with other people as well, and allowed for people to kind of share their own experiences in a public way as with me and with others, and then talk about other issues that are tied to sexual assault and other things that we can do. And so that was really kind of a lovely way to feel like I had gotten to this new place. And then from this piece, actually, if you'll go on to the next slide, I started to translate performance back into 2D work, which was, I think, an interesting kind of direction, because part of the reason I'd gone into performance was to create actionable movement and try to connect art making to more actionable things like the legislative work I was doing. But I also needed to continue to process and continue to think of different ways to engage people in these ideas. And I didn't think that, and for me, while I think the performance is a really bodily way and a visceral experience for people, there's something about 2D work that sort of opens you up in a different way and kind of enables you to slowly engage in maybe a less reactive way. And so I wanted to figure out how to translate those same performance images, which if you cycle through a couple of these, Lali, these are a lot of the figures in these drawings are from the performance, but they're overlaid with text and other images and other drawings from journals, from notes I had taken during my legislative work. You can stop here. And then those are overlaid with the actual figurative work. And so I'm thinking about, again, like these idea of layers and complication in the work, and how these issues are sort of not just something flat and static that's easy to look at or easy to understand, that you have to kind of look at them in these intricate, complicated ways and understand all of those complications to really get at them. And those sort of simple 2D drawings, which existed on their own in many iterations, became a part of these larger installations. So this includes those drawings that we just saw, but also includes a lot of other elements. And so I wanted to like try to complicate these ideas even more. Like a drawing is this one thing you look at, and the issue, so especially an issue like sexual assault or domestic violence, these are things that are not simple. They're not just one thing. They're not just one moment. And so trying to illustrate how complex they are becomes like this whole puzzle for me and a whole challenge, because I want, my goal ultimately with so much of this work is understanding. And unless you're someone who's directly experienced something, it can be so difficult to understand. It can feel impossible, and I think that difficulty is often where we find the act of othering, where we find people saying, well, that something must have happened, or where you sort of find people dismissing it out of just a lack of understanding, right? And so it's like the barrier to empathy, right? And so the idea that I'm often trying to get at is that if we can just try to understand more and try to get at that experience, then the empathy becomes a little, like it becomes a little easier. You get a little bit closer to it. So an installation like this, which incorporates those drawings, also incorporates newer drawings and other objects, and is huge. This is a 30-foot long installation of drawings and objects and text and fabric. And every piece of it is something that you have to engage with. You can sort of look at it from far away like this. To really get at it, you have to get up close and really spend time with it. And so if you'll go to the next slide, you can see that there's small text. One of the things that this piece also tackles is not just like sexual assault or the act of it. It's also talking about my recovery, which those drawings really, really were tackling. It also talks about the trauma my mother experienced, and is something that I only learned about once I got older because of my work as an advocate. Then I started to, because I was speaking openly about these experiences in my artwork and as an advocate, my mother was able to open up to me about her own experiences in a way that she never had. And that was like that's like one example of how just speaking openly about something that's happened to you or about an issue that's difficult really allows other people to then share and open up about their own experiences in a way they might not have. So even my mother, who has experienced in her own life a great deal of trauma and overcome so much of it throughout her life, she'd never really shared with me. And so she began writing, well, we started writing letters for this one year. I was doing a lot of artist residencies, and I saved all the letters and then later asked her permission to start using them in this work. And the idea was to think about all the trauma she'd endured and overcome, and how that does or doesn't carry on into future generations, like what parts of it you can let go of and what parts of it kind of never leave you. Intergenerational trauma is something I'm deeply interested in, and it's something that impacts So many people for various reasons, whether it's race or gender-based violence, or, you know, so many other things. And it's unfortunately just like within the deepest threads of our society and culture. And you know, for my family in particular, what we seem to be overcoming the most is sexual trauma. And it's just kind of amazing what you overcome on your own, but then what also you can go through and get through together once you start sharing. And so if you'll go to the next slide. So this piece is like sort of these multiple steps. There's this portion that deals with my mom's history, and then it slowly molds into this dealing with my own history, and then sort of also talking about the piece in a larger scale way as well. And so like, it's not just our personal experiences, but what this might look and feel like to any survivor. And again, this idea is that you can look at it from far away, but you also, to really experience it fully, have to kind of move through it physically, even though it's flat against the wall, because there's all these different elements. You can go to the next slide. And part of it, you know, the sort of recovery part is always really fascinating to me and really interesting to me, because there's so many different paths to recovery. If you'll go to the next slide. And for a lot of my recovery was centered around the legislative work I did, and sort of the choices I started to make later on, and the ways I've actually actively engaged with my history, rather than the years when I was ignoring it or not doing anything about it or not talking about it or sharing it. And so these, you'll see in this installation, there are actual notes and pieces of legislation and articles and things that were written or that I wrote that are included in the piece. And part of the work I was doing around those 2 years I was working on those bills was also engaging other people in the legislative process, which was satisfying this whole idea that I had, where it was like, I didn't just want to make art that talked about these things. I also wanted to figure out how to engage people in action. And so that was a huge part of this. You can go to the next slide. So I definitely continued to like think in terms of installation. At this time, I was doing a lot less performance because this was like I was in the middle of grad school, actually. So and sort of somewhere in the middle of all of the stuff that I'm talking about, I started grad school at Georgia State University. And in the middle of grad school, I had a child. I had a baby. So I was not performing as much as I used to. I was still doing a lot of the other stuff. I was still doing a lot of the community work and volunteering and obviously making artwork, but I was finding that my body was wearing out a lot faster. And so, which was then making me, of course, return to other ideas that I'd had around mental health, but also physical health. And so this is an installation that I made around that time for an exhibition where I had assumed I would make work similar to the piece you just saw around sexual assault and all of the gender-based violence and the work I'd been doing for a long time, because that was sort of what had become expected of me, I think, artistically. And I was finding myself coming up short constantly and like feeling like I couldn't find the energy for that work, and finding myself really unable. It was also that larger installation happened. It was after, there was some like of the Me Too movement stuff had come right around then too. And I was just basically feeling like absolutely drained and like it wasn't something I could continue to do. Like there's a interesting point where you're like, you have to be able to say like, I don't need to, or I can't talk about this because it's better for me to actually like talk about something else. So there's this push and pull between talking and sharing and being open and also protecting yourself that becomes really important if this is the kind of work you're going to be making. And I was hitting that point and that wall and learning that lesson really actively. And so I had this deadline and I had to make this piece. And I was also seeing a lot of other people I knew experiencing burnout, which is essentially what I'm talking about, right? and mental health and things like this, and our inability to sort of approach it in a really active and healthy way, especially if you're used to sort of working and hustling and constantly moving. And at the same time, I was also reading, rereading, I think at this point, The Yellow Wallpaper, which is a text, it's a sort of highly touted feminist text about a woman who, it's not very long, and it's just a beautiful little story, but it's about a woman who, she becomes ill. She's a Victorian era woman, and she becomes ill, and her husband's a doctor who doesn't really seem to believe that she's sick, and basically like isolates her in this country house in a room with this yellow wallpaper. Whereas the basically what happens is she begins to lose her mind in this room. And it's not very long and it's very intense, but the sort of themes of this story are really enduring, because it's essentially like watching her husband disbelieve everything she's saying about what she's feeling, about her health, about her mental health, and not listen to her kind of say, like, here's what I need. Like, she wants to write, she wants to go outside. She doesn't really want to sit in this room or this house. And he's like, no, you just have to rest. You have to like stay put. He calls her like my blessed little goose, which is such a dehumanizing, like patronizing thing. So he's like also infantilizing her in this way. And it's really indicative of the sort of the times, but also this text is so enduring because it's so much a part of how women are treated in the medical field in general, and to this day. And in particular, of course, this is like triply bad for women of color. And so at the time, I was primarily focused on this idea of mental health. And you can go to the next slide. Sorry, there's a few slides of this installation. And let's stop here for now for a second. And so I was thinking about this in terms of like how we dismiss it ourselves, but also how women's mental health diagnoses are often lacking, both as youth and as adults. And then how the medical field tends to really just dismiss what we're feeling and thinking, even when we know it's real. And this piece is something that I'm really interested in, and I've continued to work and research around, because I'm also connecting it not just at this point in my life, not as much at the point I was creating it, but I'm also connecting it to our physical health, and particularly for mothers and new mothers and maternal health. If you don't know, our country is one of the worst for maternal health. And this is like especially bad for Black women of color, and women of color in general. And so this is sort of where the direction the work is taken. But this installation was something that you could walk into. Like, I had created this room out of these double-sided drawings, and you could sit there and sort of engage with the work in a really solitary way. And there's these double images of women sort of falling apart inside of it, in text, pieces of the text. You can go to the next slide. And these are sort of examples of the double-sided drawings that built some of the walls. But anyways, you can go to the next slide. This work really became something that was really having me think about health, both physical and mental, and our bodies, and what others expect of us, and then what we also expect of ourselves. And so you can go to the next slide. So these are just some of the drawings. And I think, oh, okay, sorry. I was skipping ahead a little bit, but so this continues sort of these like drawing installations, and also the stories of my mother. And so I feel like I'm jumping around a little bit, and I apologize, but my if you'll go back one slide. So these images that I chose for this installation are all from images of my mother. Because at this point, I'd been working with her stories so much and with her image so much that my mom had become, in a way for me, very iconic. She's white, but she is a woman that has experienced sort of the full spectrum of gender-based violence in all the sort of mundane ways of like the everyday sexism that we come to expect as women or that we come to experience, to the more, unfortunately, like just really drastic, horrible things that we also unfortunately have come to expect as women. And so in my work, in a way, my mom had become this icon of like women in general, with the caveat, of course, that she's white, and so that there are limits to the experiences we can describe through that image, right? So you'll go to the next slide. But of course, like I was realizing this icon that my mom was becoming as I was also starting to develop my thesis work for grad school. And so this is sort of the main backbone of my thesis work, which is I call it the matriarch timeline. And it's built in a similar way to a lot of the paper-based, drawing-based installations that I've been working with. But instead, I was really diving specifically into my mother's story. So there's not any one specific issue that I'm tackling through this work. There's not any one particular story that I wanted to focus on. Instead, I was thinking about womanhood as this general thing, as this general, and this idea of the spectrum of violence as something that ranges, that we have, that women have come to know as something that is a part of our lives, and that ranges in this broad way. Throughout most of our lives, unfortunately. And how to talk about that in one life that is both like specific but broad enough for anybody to engage with. And so I also like selfishly am like an archivist of my family, and I just want to know everything about everybody in my family. And so I'm also doing this deep research and dive into like the letters my mother and father, who have been divorced as long as I've been alive, into like from when they were together, and the journals that my mom wrote as we were growing up that she very, very generously allowed me to read, and anything I can find that helps me understand her life better and her experiences better. And so this timeline really basically covers her entire life and all of the childhood trauma she endured, but also all of the things she did and overcame it with at the same time. And the idea was just to represent that picture fully and to remind us that, like, despite this history, there's a fully fledged person in front of it, behind it, in it constantly. And so even as we're tackling these ideas of trauma and violence, that we have to remember that there's a lot more in it. So if you'll go on to the next slide. These are just details of some of those pieces. You can cycle through these until we get to the next. And for my mom too, there's a lot of investigation of like sexuality and gender identity and things like this, because that was a huge part of our family's story as well. Although I haven't tackled as much of that in this conversation. So for my mom, and we can stop here. For my mom, there's a huge question of identity as being hugely important to her life, because of the trauma she endured, because of the makeup of her family, and then the choices she made to create her own family, there's a constant push and pull of identity as well that's centered around labor and independence and things like that. And so not only was I think interested in this larger history and this larger idea of the spectrum of violence, but I was also interested in what the struggle would be for someone like her now, who has experienced all of this and overcome it, but is now also like still probably struggling, because we all are. And so I started thinking about these soft sculptures, which also were a part of the thesis. And these were, I'm calling these tired bodies. And these first iterations were like screenshots or quick captures, I guess, of experiences that women in my family were dealing with now. And so this circular one here is called The Caretaker, and it's essentially a portrait of my mother in the moment. And the idea is thinking about this dilemma of identity for her, which was that as a child, she was taking care of her family. As a young adult, she was taking care of her family, and this was a role she didn't always choose. And so this labor of motherhood and care is something that's often forced upon women, and all that entails. But the sort of ironic part being, now that I have my own daughter, and my mom has sort of opted to assist with caretaking, like she's made that choice now, but it's a hugely like she's like volunteered now for that role, and so the way she's embraced it and the way it feels to her is so different, which is, I think, really interesting. If you'll go to the next slide, and then this is just another view of that piece, and then you can see the installation behind it. This is the dilemma, which highlights something from my sister. Actually, I have a twin sister, and she's like brilliant and just a very hard worker. So she's someone who's like thrown herself into her career, right? But more so than me, has always wanted a family and like dreams of having like 5 children and things like this. And I'm like the one who had a kid first, and like honestly probably would have been okay never having kids, although I love my daughter. It's just like very funny. And so for her, the struggle was always like, how do you balance this whole idea of being like, you're supposed to be this woman in the workforce. If you choose to get married and have kids, what does it do to this career that you love? But if you also love the idea of family and having one, like, how can you do both? Because of course the question for women is, how do you do both? And so this idea of, again, just labor and motherhood kind of became central to the initial tired bodies that I built. And if you'll go to the next slide. But tired bodies evolved really quickly from that, primarily because when I first started thinking about them, I was really, it seemed like I was really focused on motherhood, but I was also really very much tied back to the same ideas I'd been exploring in earlier performances around language and labor and the physical sort of manifestations of mental health problems and the ways we take on certain things, except that it was also just like much more focused on like the actual physical things we also do to ourselves. I don't know. It was like, it's a very weird push-pull, because when I first started thinking about the tired bodies, I wasn't really thinking about the fact that I was a new mother. But it seems so obvious to me now that that was a huge part of it. It's just when I was making them, I was really just thinking about the fact that I was a grad student, and I felt like I had to be making work constantly, and I didn't necessarily, and I felt like I had to be saying yes to people constantly in my community, but I felt like I was falling short as well. And so there was this other aspect to it that was not necessarily related to motherhood. Instead, it was related to hustle culture and this idea that we kind of constantly have to be working and producing to be valuable. And that was something that I was really struggling with, because I no longer really felt the same way I did about that idea as I had when I was maybe like 22. And so I was thinking like, and I'm still learning a lot about these ideas. Like, this is really new work for me. It feels old already because it was from last year, but that's ridiculous. 2019 wasn't that long ago. It just feels that way. And so I'm a little less certain when I'm talking about this work because I'm still learning so much about it. But one of the things I love most about tired bodies is that they seem to take on a new shape or meaning with every thing that happens in the world and everything that I do, or research or read or learn about, or every space that I install them in. So this is this specific tired body I call Big Mama, and she was one of the first ones I built outside of those two that you saw in my thesis exhibition. And she wasn't really reflecting on a specific experiences like the other two. Instead, she was just a general tired body that I knew I would install in installation after installation. And so this was the first installation I put her in, where I was really embracing these ideas of motherhood and labor and expectations around those things. And so this is called Time Out with Big Mama. And if you go to the next slide, and this is her in a different installation, which you will see another image of, but where she's actually more reclining, right? She's more restful. And the funny thing about her is that although first she was sort of this really, I thought, really funny representation of fatigue and someone who's so worn, or a body that's so worn out that it's falling apart and barely able to like sit upright, and all of its limbs are just so stretched out and worn out. She slowly becomes something that's like a little bit defiant in all of her fatigue. So instead of sort of this like exhausted pose, she's like reclined in this very like classic beauty, like nude, like classical nude kind of portrait pose. And the thing is that for me, she became something that's a little bit more like embracing the rest rather than like falling into it after being overworked. And I really have enjoyed that evolution because for one thing, it's almost like it is funny to me. I laugh a lot at these guys, and you'll see some of the stop motion that I have made with her. But I also think it's like it's really hard to shift from a mindset of constantly producing and the expectations we have of ourselves to be productive. That culture that we are a part of that expects us to constantly be working. I mean, even through this year, we see that as a part of like these constant Zoom calls and artist talks and things like this that we're doing online all the time, even though our world is changing constantly around us. But the expectations we have on ourselves and that others place on us as well, or that the culture or society places on us, instead of it just being a force that works upon you, which is, I think, what the earlier tired bodies really felt like, they started to become something that was like, well, yes, I'm exhausted, but I'm going to take this rest. I mean, look at me, I have to rest, and I'm going to do it really beautifully. And it's become a little bit more like that, which feels a little bit more celebratory and resistant. And I've enjoyed that growth, but it's still something I'm investigating. So if you'll go to the next slide, these are, this is sort of another corner of that installation. And again, it's just like another tired body that's decided to just sit and veg alongside. You can see Big Mama in the background. And if you'll keep to the next slide. This is the video that was in that production that you can actually see. The TV in the previous slide is what this was screening on. And so we can go ahead and watch it. This is a stop motion piece. So this is, just so everyone knows, this is the first stop motion video that I ever made. and with obviously with This Is Big Mama in it, and again, I was making something that made me laugh a little bit, but I also was really just thinking about how ridiculous it is. This like, we're so exhausted moving through these daily routines and falling apart. You can go to the next slide. And one of the other things I've really enjoyed about the Tired Bodies is how they've allowed me to work in different mediums, right? And really capture these ideas and experiences in different ways. One of the best parts, I think, about my practice that I've enjoyed the most is that I'm really interested in figuring out how to talk about these ideas, these experiences in ways that can really invite people into them. And the way that I'm able to do that, I think, most effectively is when I can adapt the medium to the experience. And so for Tired Bodies, it's these giant soft sculptures, and now it's video work. And I'm also now making these smaller sculptures as well. And this is an example of one of the Tired Bodies I've made this year since the pandemic started, and they're much smaller. They're about this big. They fit into my hands. And like I said earlier, one of the other parts of the Tired Bodies, besides like sort of their adaptability to medium, is also their adaptability to the moment. You know, for me, they've done everything from talk about, you know, labor and fatigue and hustle culture, to motherhood and labor and expectations, to, we didn't see some of these pieces as much, but like body image and expectation and things like that, to now just sort of like coping and coping as a larger society through something that is a serious trauma that we will all deal with and things like that. And so there's like sort of, again, this like blank canvas that they become, where they start to adapt to almost any idea, which is also, I think, something I have to be careful about, because I know that there are limits to how well you can talk about everything. So you have to be pretty specific. And again, this is still new work for me, so I'm doing a lot of research and reading. You can go to the next slide. But these are the ones that I created since the pandemic started in my studio. I've really only made these small pieces for now. And they're just like, this one is called What Day Is It Where You Are? Which is an actual question I asked somebody on a Zoom call during a work meeting. It's like, what day is it where you are? And it's like the kinds of questions we ask ourselves or others right now are just not seated in any kind of reality that any of us have been used to, although we kind of all now are. You can go to the next slide. This one is called Bad Hammies. And the next one is Separation Anxiety, which is pretty tough. So I think that's it, but this sort of last slide you want to go to is, yeah, so I feel like there's a lot of things I could cover even more. I will say that since my MFA exit, which was in 2019, was the beginning of the spring of 2019, I found myself really struggling a little bit with my practice. I've been working on Tired Bodies. I've been working on lots of ideas and reading research, but I find myself really separated from community in the way that I used to be. I haven't been doing as much policy work or advocacy work as I'm accustomed to, and it's been really difficult. I used to say that it was such an important part of my studio practice, which after during my thesis, I had to cut back on a lot of that stuff. And because it just isn't possible, that you don't have enough hours or energy, and you have to take care of yourself. But I also find that without that practice, without the practice of community and policy work and advocacy work that was so hugely important to me, it is harder for me to make the studio work that I find really invigorating. And so I have found that the disconnect has been really challenging. In addition, I've moved. So while I still do a lot of work in Atlanta, I now live in Florida. And so I'm kind of establishing myself in a new community and figuring out, how does legislative policy work here? Because while it's very similar in a lot of places, you kind of have to learn the ropes of each community you live in and what's important there. And so I'm finding myself doing a little bit more stepping back and a little bit more watching and listening and creating while still like very much a feature of my practice, like obviously like being in my studio every day, I'm finding myself working on sort of alternative projects while I sort of lay the groundwork for being more engaged in the new community I'm a part of. And I think that's good. It's just really different. But I like to be really transparent about that. But one of the things I am working on this is like a list of the stuff I'm working on, because I was like, maybe I'll have extra time to talk about it, but I think I'm running out. But I will say one of the things I'm really excited about is this monumental tired body that I'll be building in Atlanta, and it's moving me into the research of, I'm continuing research around labor and rest. And I found like basically people who have done far more work in these areas than I could ever have hoped to accomplish on my own. So I've been grateful to learn about them and their work. But the other things that are really vital to the project I'm working on, I'm thinking about ideas around gift economy, ideas around community care, and communal sort of care and rest as well. And so those are some ideas that I'm kind of dealing with now, in addition to some of these other things. But I think I'll wrap it up there. That's about probably time for me, right?
Thank you so much, Jessica, for sharing with us all of those like artworks and installations. Were super interesting, and just to hear all of the backstory within them was really powerful. So now we're just going to go into a Q&A with Jessica. If any of y'all have any questions, you can put it in the Q&A section, but I will start us off with a few questions that I have of my own. So, with the tired body sculptures, you started these during the pandemic. What keeps you motivated for creating art? Because I know the pandemic was like such a hard time for artists to just create. So what keeps you motivated?
Well, I'll say at the beginning of the pandemic, well, I just I was really, really lucky. I just did a residency, like a month-long residency at Vermont Studio Center right before the pandemic started. Like literally I got home and like 3 days later we were locked down. Like that's how soon it was. And so I had just come off this whole like month-long creative like focus, which is not something I'd had since I'd left school anyway. So I was already sort of like jazzed up from that. So I think there was some residual energy from that experience that actually really like I was able to leverage into several months of actually very active art making during the first few months of the pandemic. And I work remotely. I have a day job I work for a nonprofit still that's 20 hours a week, but it's always been remote. So it's always been a part of my life when I was in grad school, when I was in residency, things like that. It's something I've constantly done. And so honestly, there weren't initially a lot of major changes from my life because I worked from home already with my child already, who wasn't old enough to be in school. And so my practice, that meant that there weren't many changes in my studio practice outside of what I just mentioned about sort of being in a new community and trying to learn a new community, which is very, very difficult to do during the pandemic. So the first few months were actually not that hard, which is actually when I made a lot of those little tiny sculptures. And I was doing a lot of drawings too. But I will say the last few months have been much harder. I haven't made really any of my own studio work in probably about 2 months. And it kind of coincided with a couple other things, like I'm teaching virtually, which is really hard. And so big props to people who are teaching far more than I am virtually. It's really difficult. And so I'm doing that. And on top of that, I did actually open a community art space here where I'm at, and that has taken up a lot of my time, but that has enabled me to support other artists, which has been an act and service that I've been wanting to engage with for a long time anyway. So even though my own studio practice has quieted in the past few months, I'm finding myself like actually putting more energy out into other things, into other people, which has been a really actually rewarding time for me, I think. For me, I'm an artist. I think there are artists who feel like they have to be like producing work in their studio every day, all year round, constantly. And I think that's an incredibly like amazing way to work, but it's not ever been my reality. I tend to go through like several months of super active production, and then I spend a few months or a long time like reading and researching and working with other artists or other people or other things, and then I come back to the studio and I'm super active. So that's not a clear answer, but I'll say like I think I basically just maintained. I don't know that I'm like staying more motivated than anything else, or I'm just maintaining a status quo for myself, just barely. So
Definitely, and that's totally okay. I know your mother, you mentioned that your mother influenced a lot of your work and that your family was supportive of you being an artist, but how does she feel about your work now? Does she go to your installations? You know, how is that?
my mom is super supportive. She's actually one of the participants watching this artist talk. So I would say that not just my mom, my whole family continues to be like my biggest champions. That's like includes my sister, includes my dad, my stepmom, my little brother. I have a little brother and sister and an older brother as well. And everyone's sort of on board constantly, even when I make really hard stuff or things that might be embarrassing or challenging for them to embrace. So.
All right, I see we have some questions rolling in from the participants, so I'll go ahead and ask them to you. Adriana asked, the topics that you covered about are traumatic. Does your art ever affect you to the point where you cannot continue with the piece?
Yes, that is absolutely a factor in the work. So a couple of things happen when you're making work about like, so I keep talking about this idea of like being open and sharing. And I think it's a really powerful tool, whether you're making artwork or writing or just talking. Like sharing stories is this huge tool we have to talk to help people understand things that they haven't experienced, right? Like this is, I feel like we all know this, whether you're making art or not. But what also happens when you start to talk really openly about stuff like this is that if you become well known for it, which in my former community in Atlanta was something that, I mean, I just became known as a person who knew about gender-based violence issues and was open to talking about them. And so there were two things that were happening. I was asked to talk about my own experiences a lot, and I found people disclosing their personal experiences to me frequently. Both of which are things that I think are really beautiful. But when I was first sort of like when the first time that happens, or when that first starts to happen a lot, if you don't know how to like sort of create boundaries around those things, it can become something that can be very overwhelming and obviously very emotionally draining. So I learned quicker, I think, how to create boundaries about sharing my own experiences, and including like when I needed to take a break from certain kinds of artwork. So especially around the sexual assault related work, which was obviously directly tied to my own experiences, like I started making work about my Puerto Rican family around that time, and I wasn't sharing it publicly. It was something I would just make in my studio for me. But essentially, if I needed a break from talking about this issue, these really traumatic experiences, I'd go work on this other body of work that I knew I didn't have to show anybody or talk about to anybody. Of course, now I'm showing that work publicly, but back then it was like just for me. It was something I was creating just because I needed to step away from this and do something different. And so absolutely, I would have to recognize when that was necessary. The other thing I had that took much longer and is something I still struggle with today is other people disclosing their experiences to me. Because I feel like in a way, like I struggle a little bit about the responsibility of that and whether I have, what kind of responsibility I have to that. Especially if I am feeling limited in the resources I have to then give them, because I'm not, I'm not a licensed professional in any way, you know, I just happen to be or I used to, I feel like less connected now that I've moved, but I happen to at one point be incredibly connected to resources and people that could be directly helpful. And so I'd feel like, okay, if you tell me what's going on, I can find the right people for you. But then I became, I would feel like overly responsible for making sure that people were okay, which is not necessarily my job either. But there is like a push-pull there. Like I'm the one opening up those doors. So I'm still like learning a little bit about those boundaries. And I definitely had to say sometimes like, I'm not doing that work right now, but here's somebody who can help you instead. So sorry, I hope that answers. I feel like I'm kind of talking a little bit in circles.
No, I definitely think you answered that question, and you're definitely right about, establishing those boundaries. We have another question. Is there a way we can donate to the community art space you've made, or for your future ventures in general?
Yes. So the community art space I've created is called Good News Arts, and I don't know if I should like type it into the chat or anything. It's we're in the process of getting our 501c3 status, so donating technically isn't like via like official like federally, but you can still give to the space or purchase prints from our online shop, which support artists and the space. I think that's like the best way to do it. And then I don't really take donations. I appreciate that, but I do sell my work. And so if you're ever interested in a commission or my work, I have a very active Instagram and a less active Facebook, and I do have a website. So I can share all of that information with you all in the chat maybe. And that might be like, yeah.
Definitely feel to put it in the chat, but again, this is all recorded, and I think all of that information is at the beginning, but definitely put it in the chat. Y'all should follow her on Instagram and check out her website, where I went over it, and it details all of the exhibitions, and even more so that the ones were presented here. One final question that I have for you is, what advice do you have for anyone who's interested in pursuing art, who may have not had that support that you had,
I think finding that support is really key, because if it's not your family, I guarantee there's somebody who is going to be that support for you. And like a lot of us have chosen families too, or instead of like biological family. And I think that's really important to acknowledge and to remember that like, even if the sort of blood relationships you have aren't as supportive of you, I'm sure there are communities you can find that will be. And for me as an artist, while my family is super supportive, one of the key turning points for me too in the past like few years has been, I mentioned them really briefly, but like I developed a relationship with 4 of the women that I was performing the 3 everyday performance with. And we eventually formed a collective, an artist collective. And it's very loose and it's not like super, we've done a handful of projects together, but more than anything, the women in this group have become a sort of second artistic family for me. They really, I get really emotional when I talk about it, because we really formed right when I was about to have like my baby in the middle of grad school when we formed the collective, and we'd already been working together in various ways for years, but the solidification of this like artistic family and these people that I could go to with my work, but also with like this new motherhood and many other things, was really pivotal to me like surviving that first year of motherhood, I think, and still making art and still like trying to be a part of the world. And I think a lot about that. I think it took me a long time to find that sort of closeness in art, in an artistic family. And I wish sometimes that I had found it sooner, but I also think I found it when I needed to. But I think like seeking that out, finding the people who are going to champion you, and that you can champion in return, I think that's been really crucial too. Because it's also, I don't know if anybody's read Bell Hooks on Love, but I'm rereading it right now. And it's like, it's for research, it's for art, but it's also something that's just such a powerful read because it's reminding me that like loving relationships aren't just you being supported and championed, but it's also you nurturing that love in return. And that can be, doesn't have to be familial, you know, it can be the people you choose to surround yourself with. So
Well, thank you so much, Jessica, for coming on here and talking to us about your art. And thank you to everyone else who made it here and asked questions. It was really appreciated. Thank you